there's this ancient tradition in the Jewish culture called the yoke of a rabbi. And the yoke of a rabbi supposedly means what the rabbi or the teacher understands to be the greatest and most important command out of the law of God, and then something that would help us kind of achieve and accomplish doing that. So every Jewish person would recite every morning and every evening this prayer called the Schema. And they would start by saying, "Hear, O Israel, your Lord, the God is one, and He is God." And then they would talk about loving God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. And they would make this prayer every morning and every evening. And that prayer is found in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And everybody would understand that that's the greatest command. So when you would ask a rabbi what's the greatest commandment in the whole Bible and the whole Torah, they would answer like that. But every rabbi would have a yoke. And this yoke meant the way that they believed that first command was going to be accomplished. So if you would ask certain rabbis, well, what is your yoke? They would say Deuteronomy chapter 6, Shema Israel, hear, O Israel. And then they would say the second command that they believed they could do in order to accomplish the first command. So some rabbis would say something like that, like, hear, O Israel is the greatest command, and keep the Sabbath is the second greatest command. So if you keep the Sabbath, you are loving God. Other rabbis would say that, hear, O Israel is the greatest command, but make the sacrifices at the right appointed festivals. And if you do that, then you're loving the Lord your God. And then we have Jesus, who gets asked the same question, who puts his yoke on the table. And he tells us a different response than what many people were used to at the time. So for the next few days, we're actually going to look at his response little bit by little bit, and we're going to try to understand what Jesus meant when he said this. So the story we're talking about today is found in Matthew chapter 22. When Jesus is asked by certain Jewish leaders and very good religious people. I'm going to read from verse 34 all the way to verse 40. The Pharisees, when they heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, gathered together in one place, and testing him, one of them, a lawyer, asked, "Teacher, what is the greatest command in the Torah?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." This is the first and greatest command. But the second one is like this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The entire Torah and the prophets hang on these two commands. When they were asking him, what is the greatest command? They were asking him for his yoke. They were telling him, okay, so what do you think is the yoke? Jesus, what is the greatest command? And everybody knew the answer was going to be Deuteronomy chapter 6. But they were wanting to know from Jesus as a teacher, as a rabbi, but how do we accomplish that? How do we get to love the Lord our God with all our heart, our soul, and all our might? And Jesus' answer is not do this ritual or fulfill this vow or make this offering or keep a holy day. Jesus' answer is Leviticus chapter 19. Love your neighbor as yourself. And that is what is so mind-blowing about his yoke, because what Jesus is trying to say is that if you love your neighbor, you're loving God. Or if you want to love God, you have to love your neighbor. There's no kind of divide here that sometimes in the religious circles we want to make, that I want to have this personal, intimate relationship with God, but church and people, I don't have to deal with them because God and I are so close and so together. I mean, I've heard the statement of people being said to me many times, and I get it. I mean, I understand why they say it. People have been hurt and burned out by the church and what is so-called the church, and people have all these negative feelings. But the statement still doesn't resonate within me, because how can we say, oh, I love Jesus, I just don't like Christians. Oh, I love God and I want to have a deep relationship with God, but people, I don't have to deal with people. I don't want to go to church, all this kinds of stuff. Because we're trying to separate God from people. Because God, it's easy, right? We don't have to deal and have dynamic engagement with God. We can just trust Him and love Him, or He loves us, and it's all nice and good. But people sometimes suck, and they hurt us, and they really just don't make us walk on this life any easier. And I get it. I get it that so many of us have been so hurt in the past that loving people is so difficult. But what Jesus says right here in His yoke is that if we ever want to accomplish the command of loving God, we have to love people. And what He says is not like love the Christians or love the people at church or love your friends. He says love your neighbor as yourself. In another story in the book of Luke, somebody asked him, okay, so who's my neighbor? Who's your neighbor? And he tells this entire story of a parable of a Samaritan that would be a good study to have one day. But the basic point that Jesus is trying to make in that story is that you are neighbor to anybody you choose to be neighborly to. You don't get to choose based on your circle of influence or your prejudice or assumptions who you get to be neighbors to. The actual neighbor is the one that crosses the boundaries of any circle or denomination or clique and goes beyond that and serves and loves and gives to everybody the same. So when Jesus is saying love your neighbor as yourself, He includes everybody, even those people that hurt us, even the people that say like really useless things about race or about class or about sex and all this nonsense that people and the oppression. Jesus is saying we gotta love them too. Because if we want to love God, we have to love our neighbors. And that's what is so challenging about His yoke, because it's not, oh, I love God by keeping a day or by making a sacrifice. I love God by the way I love people. So in a sense, almost it sounds like Jesus is saying that the way you treat people is the way you're treating God. You can't be all super religious and lift up your hands and worship the song in the morning, and then the next thing you do is you trash talk or you gossip behind somebody's back. You can't be reading your Bible and saying, oh man, God is so awesome, and the next thing you do is impatient to your friend or to the neighbor next to you or even your family members. There's been research that shows that in the past few days of quarantine, families are being forced to stay together so much that they're actually finding it so frustrating because they never spend that much time together. So people are having so much conflict, and sometimes the hardest one to be loving towards is our own family members. So when Jesus is asking us to love our neighbors, it includes the neighbors in our own home, in our own family, and how tense and dynamic that is. But this word love, what did Jesus mean by that? Because that word is packed with meaning when we read it in its own Jewish context. When Jesus said these words, He wasn't speaking English. He was most likely speaking Hebrew or maybe Aramaic. But the word in Hebrew for love is the word ahava. And ahava is this like love that is not a feeling. Sometimes we understand or misunderstand actually love as this feeling or emotion that I have, and if I have this feeling towards somebody, then I can love them. But that's not the way Jesus understands love, and that's not the way that He wants us to understand this command, His yoke. He doesn't want us to have nice feelings towards people or nice feelings towards God. He wants us to have ahava. And what is ahava? Well, ahava can be translated as covenantal kind of love or faithful, loyal kind of love. Ahava is the word that is used when two married people make vows in the Jewish culture. And they would make vows to be faithful and committed towards each other for the rest of their days. And then once one of those partners would die, at their funeral, if this person was loyal and faithful to their spouse, the community would say, oh, this man, oh, this woman really ahavad his spouse or her spouse, because they were loyal and faithful and committed to them for the rest of their lives. Ahava, it's a choice. It's something that you decide upon and you're stern with, and therefore you make different decisions because of that. Ahava is not a magical feeling or a nice inner thought or something that just kind of like comes and goes and fluctuates. Ahava is this consistent, committed loyalty that we must have for God and for one another. Ahava is the kind of love that Jesus showed when he went to the cross. That no matter if it costed him his own life, he was loyal and faithful to God and to us as his brothers and sisters, as his people, as his community. Ahava is the kind of love that people make vows in their wedding. Ahava is the kind of love that a mother has for her child, that no matter what this child does and how he rebels or she rebels or totally disregards them, this mother just will continuously pour out and give and give and give. Ahava is the word that Jesus uses in this context, in his yoke, by telling us that that's how we should love God. That's how we should love our neighbor. We should ahava. For the next few days, we're going to look at how that ahava is played out. Because Jesus says that we must ahava God with our heart, with our soul, and with our might. What is that all about? And we're going to discuss each of them in its own original context. But for today, just for today, all that we need to know is that if we want to love God, if we want to fulfill that greatest and most important command, it all hangs and depends on how we love our neighbors, how we love the people around us. And then the second thing we need to understand is that this love is not just this gushy emotion that comes in a romantic chick flick. Love, the way Jesus describes it, ahava, is this faithful, loyal, sacrificial kind of love that puts the benefit of others before themselves, that thinks and considers the needs around them instead of the needs for itself. Ahava is the loyal love that even if it's painful, even if it costs our life, like it costed Jesus' life, we would give. Is this the kind of love you and I have for God? Is this the kind of love you and I have for his people?